A bobcat tangled in a fence, its scarred body thrashing against the wire. When the rescue team arrives, they expect an ordinary operation. But as the flashlight flickers across the animal's shimmering scar, they witness something that leaves them frozen in awe. Because this is no ordinary rescue. It's a miraculous encounter that will ripple far beyond that rainy night. What is the secret of the scarred bobcat? And how could it hold the key to one woman's deepest regrets and the family she thought she'd lost forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Lucille Parker wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic mug, letting the steam from her chamomile tea curl up toward her face. Outside her cabin windows, rain pelted the glass like tiny stones, and the old wooden shutters creaked and groaned with each gust of wind. Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the cozy yet cluttered room feel even smaller. Her gaze drifted to the collection of photographs scattered across her coffee table. In one, a teenage Maggie grinned broadly, her graduation cap slightly crooked, eyes sparkling with dreams of the future. In another, a younger Maggie sat at her first art easel, paint smudged across her cheeks. Lucille's heart squeezed at the memories. 5 years, she whispered to herself, running her finger along the edge of a silver frame. 5 years since that terrible argument. 5 years of silence. Another crack of thunder shook the cabin, closer this time. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches scratch against the roof like desperate fingers. Lucille pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and reached for her tea. That's when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A scream pierced through the storm's chaos, unlike anything she'd heard before. It was raw and desperate, somewhere between human and animal, full of pain and fear. Lucille's hand trembled as she set down her mug. "Hello?" she called out, though she knew no one could hear her through the cabin walls. The scream came again, sending chills down her spine. She grabbed her flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped onto her front porch. The rain immediately soaked through her clothes, and cold droplets ran down her neck. Sweeping the flashlight beam across her yard, she could barely see past the curtain of rain. The dark woods loomed ahead, full of shadows and movement. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice shaky. Only the wind answered, but then another cry, closer this time. Lucille hurried back inside, grabbed her yellow raincoat, and pulled it on. Her heart pounded as she stepped back into the storm. Following the sound, she picked her way carefully through her wet yard, mud squelching beneath her boots. The beam of her flashlight bounced off rain-slicked leaves and branches as she approached the property line where her old barbed wire fence cut through the undergrowth. A rustling in the bushes made her jump. She heard thrashing, followed by a low, pained sound. Lucille's flashlight beam caught something moving, a flash of spotted fur, then 2 glowing eyes reflecting back at her. There, tangled in the barbed wire, was a bobcat. Its fur was matted with rain and mud, and it twisted weakly against the metal barbs. When it saw her, it let out a warning growl. But the sound was feeble. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white. In that instant, Lucille saw the jagged scar running down the bobcat's side, seeming to shimmer with an otherworldly gleam in the storm's light. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat, and turned to hurry back to the cabin where she could call for help. Lucille's hand shook as she dialed the number for the Wildlife Rescue Center. Water dripped from her raincoat onto the kitchen floor, forming small puddles around her feet. The linoleum felt cold and slick beneath her boots. Blue Ridge Wildlife Rescue, this is James speaking. How can I help you? There's a bobcat, Lucille said, her voice trembling. It's caught in my fence, badly hurt. There's so much blood in this storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady herself. Ma'am, can you give me your location? James's calm voice helped anchor her. After providing her address, Lucille paced the kitchen, her wet shoes squeaking against the floor. Every few steps she peered through the window into the darkness, lightning occasionally illuminating the tree line where she'd left the trapped animal. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, clear as the day he'd spoken them on their old front porch. When the scarred bobcat appears, he'd said, his weathered face serious, change comes on swift feet. She'd been 12 then, hanging on every word of his mountain folklore. Don't be ridiculous, Lucille muttered to herself, shaking her head, but the image of that jagged scar wouldn't leave her mind. Grabbing a sturdy lantern from under the sink, Lucille stepped back out into the rain. She had to check on the creature. Folklore or not, it was suffering. The bobcat lay where she'd left it, its fur matted with rain and blood. In the lantern's steady light, she could see the scar more clearly now. It wasn't a fresh wound, as she'd first thought, but an old mark that ran along its side like a signature. The pattern seemed almost intentional, too precise to be from a random fight or accident. The animal's eyes met hers, golden and intense. Lucille felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away. There was something in that gaze, something knowing, almost human, that made her chest tighten with recognition. A deafening crack of thunder broke the spell. The bobcat growled in pain, trying to shift its position in the tangled wire. At that moment, headlights appeared through the curtain of rain, sweeping across the trees. Lucille raised her arm, waving the rescue truck toward her property. The vehicle's lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene in harsh white clarity. Relief flooded through her as she watched the truck navigate her muddy driveway, hoping these people would know what to do with this creature that felt like so much more than just an injured animal. James Mitchell stepped out of his rescue truck, rain immediately plastering his gray-streaked hair to his forehead. His movements were precise and purposeful as he grabbed his equipment bag. Two younger team members followed, carrying a large metal cage. Mrs. Parker? His voice carried easily over the storm. I'm James from Wildlife Rescue. Can you show me where the bobcat is? Lucille nodded, her lantern beam wobbling as she pointed toward the fence line. Over there, there's something strange about it. A scar on its side. James's expression remained neutral, professional. Let's take a look. He pulled out a powerful flashlight and followed Lucille through the wet grass. The bobcat lay tangled in the fence, its fur matted with rain. When James's light swept over it, the animal's eyes reflected an eerie yellow glow. The scar along its side seemed to shimmer unnaturally. Stay back, please, James instructed Lucille. His tone was gentle but firm. These animals can be unpredictable when injured. Lucille retreated a few steps, clutching her lantern close. The rain drummed steadily on her raincoat as she watched James work. His movements were slow and deliberate as he assessed the situation. The wire's wrapped around its back leg, he explained, reaching for his wire cutters. Nothing too serious. We'll have it free in no time. But the scar, Lucille started. James glanced up briefly. Probably just looks odd in the stormlight. Reflections can play tricks on us. The bobcat growled softly as James began cutting through the wire. His team stood ready with the cage, but everything changed in an instant. As soon as the last wire snapped free, the bobcat leaped up with unexpected strength. Before anyone could react, it locked eyes with Lucille, a long, penetrating stare that sent chills through her body. Then it vanished into the darkness of the woods, leaving only the sound of rustling undergrowth in its wake. I'm sorry, James said, straightening up. "Sometimes this happens. The good news is, if it could run that fast, the injuries probably aren't severe." His team began packing up their equipment, their flashlight beams bouncing through the rain. "The leg wound was minor," James assured her. "These animals are surprisingly resilient. It should heal just fine on its own." Lucille barely heard their goodbyes as she stood at the edge of her property, watching the truck's red taillights grow smaller in the distance. The rain continued to fall, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the darkness of the woods. Lucille lay in her bed, sheets twisted around her legs from hours of restless turning. The fierce storm had settled into a gentle patter against her window, but her mind raced with images of the injured bobcat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that strange, shimmering scar glowing in the darkness. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight. Its deep chimes echoed through the empty house as Lucille pulled her quilt tighter. Sleep finally came, but it brought no peace. In her dream, she stood in her kitchen, morning light streaming through the windows. A soft padding sound made her turn. There, in the doorway, stood the bobcat. Its wet fur gleamed, and that mysterious scar pulsed with an ember-like glow. The animal's eyes fixed on her, holding her frozen in place. "Maggie," a voice whispered behind the bobcat. The sound sent chills down Lucille's spine, familiar yet wrong, like a distorted recording. The kitchen dissolved, replaced by memories flooding in like water. Little Maggie at age 7, painting at the kitchen table. Teenage Maggie winning first place in the school art show. Then came that terrible night 10 years ago. 22-year-old Maggie, her face flushed with anger, portfolio clutched to her chest. "You never supported my dreams." Dream Maggie's voice cracked with emotion. "Art isn't just a hobby, Mom, it's who I am." The argument played out like a movie Lucille had watched 1,000 times, her own voice tight with fear. "I just want you to have something stable to fall back on." "Fall back on?" Maggie's bitter laugh. "I'm not falling, I'm flying. But you're too scared to see that." The slamming door thundered through the dream, louder than reality, mixing with the bobcat's low growl. The animal's scar blazed brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls. Behind it, a dark figure reached toward Lucille with misty fingers. Lucille jerked awake with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sweat dampened her nightgown despite the cool air. The soft rain continued its gentle rhythm outside, but it brought no comfort. Her hands trembled as she pushed back her silver hair. Almost against her will, her eyes drifted to the window facing the woods. The darkness pressed against the glass like black velvet, and somewhere out there, she knew the injured bobcat roamed with its mysterious scar. The morning sun crept through Lucille's bedroom window, painting soft shadows on her wall. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching from the tension of last night's fitful sleep. The dream about Maggie and the bobcat clung to her mind like cobwebs. Wrapping herself in her faded blue robe, Lucille shuffled to the kitchen and made her morning coffee. The familiar routine brought little comfort today. She stepped out onto her porch, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. The coffee mug nearly slipped from her hands when she saw them, 3 deep scratches carved into her porch railing. Her heart skipped a beat. The marks were fresh, the wood still pale where it had been stripped bare. Lucille ran her fingers over the grooves, feeling their depth. "Just a raccoon," she muttered. But even as she said it, she knew raccoon claws wouldn't make marks that big. She should call James. He'd know what to make of this. But what would she say? That she was spooked by some scratches and a folktale about a scarred bobcat. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory. When the marked one appears, change follows, like thunder after lightning. Lucille forced herself to go about her day. She pulled weeds in her vegetable garden, the soil cool and damp between her fingers. But every rustle of leaves made her look up, scanning the tree line for glowing eyes or that strange, shimmering scar. As she worked, memories of Maggie flooded back, teaching her daughter to plant tomatoes in this very garden, their laughter mixing with the chirping birds. The way Maggie's face would light up when she discovered a ripe strawberry hiding under the leaves. Such happy times before art school dreams and harsh words tore them apart. When evening settled in, Lucille stood at her kitchen window. The woods had turned dark and mysterious in the fading light. Something moved in the underbrush, just a slight shifting of leaves. She quickly locked every door and window, double-checking each latch. That evening, Lucille settled into her favorite armchair, an old paperback novel open in her lap. The fireplace crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders, trying to focus on the words on the page. But after reading the same paragraph 3 times, she gave up. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, remembering the deep scratches she'd found on her porch railing that morning. They'd been raw and fresh, cutting deep into the weathered wood. The marks seemed deliberate, almost like a message. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Lucille jumped, her heart racing. She'd never felt so unsettled in her own home before. Then she heard it, a cry piercing through the night air. It was the same haunting sound from the previous evening, half human and filled with pain. Lucille's hands trembled as she set down her book and grabbed her flashlight from the side table. Despite every instinct telling her to stay inside, she found herself stepping out onto the porch. The night air was thick and heavy, promising another storm. Sweeping her flashlight beam across the yard, she caught movement at the tree line. 2 eyes reflected back at her, glowing like golden coins in the darkness. The bobcat stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on her. But what made Lucille's breath catch in her throat was the scar. It pulsed with a faint reddish light, like embers beneath the fur. The wound seemed fresh and angry, despite the time that had passed since she'd first seen it. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the scene in stark white. For a brief moment, the scar blazed bright red, looking raw and painful. Lucille stumbled backward, her hand finding the doorknob behind her. She rushed inside, slamming the door and turning every lock. Her hands shook as she yanked the curtains closed. She pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. Later, lying in her bed, sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those glowing eyes staring back at her. The pulsing scar seemed burned into her memory. It reminded her of the way her own guilt pulsed and throbbed whenever she thought of Maggie. The harsh words they'd exchanged, the door slamming, the years of silence that followed. Lucille rolled onto her side, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The bobcat's appearance felt meaningful, like it was trying to tell her something. Maybe it wasn't just a wounded animal. Maybe, like the scar it bore, it was a sign that old wounds needed attention before they could truly heal. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves as Lucille dialed James's number. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the phone, rehearsing what to say. She didn't want to sound crazy, especially to someone as practical as James. "Wildlife Rescue, James speaking," his steady voice answered. "Hi, James, it's Lucille Parker. From the other night with the bobcat?" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was wondering if you could come check my property. There's been some damage." James arrived within the hour, his truck kicking up gravel as it pulled into her driveway. He stepped out carrying a worn toolbox, his expression professional but kind. "Show me what we're dealing with." Lucille led him first to the porch, pointing out the deep gouges in the wooden railing. James ran his fingers along the marks, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These are fresh," he noted, measuring the width with his thumb. As they walked the property line, Lucille wrestled with whether to mention the strange glow she'd seen. James worked methodically, testing fence posts and replacing a section of rusted wire. The morning breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. "The bobcat," Lucille started hesitantly, watching James work. "It keeps coming back, almost like it's watching me." James paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Animals sometimes return to familiar territory," he explained, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Some of our rescue team members—" He trailed off, securing a loose wire. "Well, they've mentioned odd experiences during certain rescues. Lights in the woods, unusual animal behavior. I always figured it was just nerves or tricks of light." Lucille seized the opening. "The scar on its side. There's something different about it. Something—" She struggled to find the right words. "Different how?" James asked, but his tone had already shifted to polite skepticism. "It glows," she said quietly. "Like it's alive somehow." James straightened up, closing his toolbox with a snap. "Miss Parker, injuries can look strange in certain light, especially at night, with flashlights and shadows playing tricks." His words were kind, but dismissive. Yet Lucille noticed how his eyes darted to the tree line and how quickly he gathered his tools. Something about the situation had unsettled him, despite his rational explanations. After James drove away, Lucille stood by the newly repaired fence. The woods stretched before her, dark and secretive. She felt no closer to understanding what was happening, but deep down, she knew the bobcat's appearances meant something more, something important. And the setting sun painted long shadows across Lucille's porch as she settled into her worn wooden chair. A cool breeze rustled the autumn leaves, carrying with it memories she'd tried so hard to forget. Her eyes fixed on the tree line, but her mind wandered back 10 years. "You can't control my whole life." Maggie's words still echoed in her head, sharp and clear as the day they were spoken. She remembered her daughter standing in their living room, college art portfolio clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Art won't pay the bills, Maggie," Lucille had said, her voice stern and unyielding. "Teaching is a stable career. It was good enough for me." The memory made her chest tighten. She could still see Maggie's face crumpling, the way her shoulders had slumped before straightening with determination. The sound of her daughter's footsteps stomping down the hallway, the slam of the screen door, and finally, the crunch of gravel under tires as Maggie drove away. Lucille wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back tears. There had been earlier signs she'd missed, or ignored, like finding Maggie's sketchbooks hidden under her mattress during middle school, or the art teacher's calls praising her daughter's talent. Instead of encouragement, Lucille had responded with lectures about responsibility and practical choices. "Just like my mother," she whispered to the darkening sky, the words bitter on her tongue. A gentle rustling from the woods drew her attention. The bobcat's scarred face flashed in her mind, its mysterious presence suddenly feeling less like a threat and more like a message. Her grandfather's words drifted back to her. "When the marked cat appears, it brings what needs to be faced." She thought of all the times Maggie had tried to share her art, the carefully drawn birthday cards, the portrait she'd done of their old dog Sam, the mural she'd painted in her bedroom, which Lucille had made her paint over. Each memory felt like a small cut to her heart. The woods grew darker, cricket songs filling the evening air. Another rustle sounded from the trees, closer this time, though nothing emerged from the shadows. Lucille leaned forward in her chair, her eyes searching the darkness. "Maggie," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds. The name hung in the air like a prayer, or perhaps a plea. The feeling of being watched intensified, bringing with it both fear and an unexpected surge of hope. The woods remained still, offering no response except the continued chorus of crickets. Yet Lucille couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes upon her, leaving her caught between wanting to run inside and needing to stay, to face whatever waited in the gathering dark. The wind chimes' discordant clatter jolted Lucille from her sleep. She blinked at the gray dawn light filtering through her curtains, her heart racing from the unexpected wake-up call. Something about the sound felt wrong, harsh and unnatural, nothing like the gentle tinkling that usually drifted through her window. Pulling her worn flannel robe tight around her shoulders and sliding her feet into her slippers, Lucille made her way to the front door. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she stepped onto the porch, the morning air crisp against her face. The wind chimes hung in a twisted mess. The copper tubes knotted together like a child's string puzzle. Lucille frowned. She'd hung those chimes herself years ago, and they'd never tangled like this before, not even in the strongest storms. As she reached up to untangle them, her eyes caught the porch railing. Her breath hitched. The scratches she'd noticed yesterday were deeper now, cutting angry lines into the wood. She ran her fingers along the grooves. They felt fresh, still rough at the edges. A musky, wild scent hung in the air, making her nose wrinkle. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, carefully working the wind chimes free. Each tube rang out discordantly as she separated them, the sound making her shoulders tense. Lucille spent the next hour checking her property, searching for signs of trespassers. The dewy grass showed no footprints, and the garden remained undisturbed. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step she took, especially near the tree line where she'd last seen the bobcat. Back on her porch, she couldn't shake the memory of that glowing scar, how it had pulsed in the darkness. These weren't random animal markings or coincidences anymore. Something deliberate was happening here. The day dragged on and Lucille's unease grew. Every rustle of leaves made her jump. Every shadow seemed to shift at the corner of her vision. As evening approached, she settled into her porch chair with a cup of chamomile tea, though its usual comfort felt hollow. Her eyes scanned the darkening woods, searching for any movement among the trees. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and expectant. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone. She needed to call James again. Maybe he'd know what to make of all this. That evening, Lucille's fingers trembled as she dialed James's number. She curled up in her armchair, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "James? I'm sorry to bother you so late, but..." She glanced nervously at the windows. "Something's not right here." "What's wrong, Lucille?" James's steady voice helped calm her racing heart. "The wind chimes were all tangled up this morning, and those scratches on the porch, they're deeper now, and I can't shake this feeling that..." A low guttural growl cut through the darkness outside her living room window. Lucille's breath caught in her throat. Her hand gripped the phone tighter as she slowly turned toward the sound. "Lucille? Are you there?" James's voice crackled through the receiver. "It's here," she whispered, her free hand trembling as she pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. There, at the edge of her porch, stood the bobcat. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed directly on her. The scar along its side pulsed with an otherworldly glow, brighter than she'd ever seen it. "The bobcat's right outside my window," she breathed into the phone. "James, it's Scar." It's glowing again." "I'll come first thing tomorrow morning," he said firmly. "I'll bring a humane trap. We'll figure this out, Lucille." She couldn't look away from the bobcat. It stood perfectly still, watching her with an unsettling intelligence. Minutes ticked by in tense silence before the creature finally turned and melted back into the woods, its scarred side casting faint pulses of light through the trees. Once it disappeared, Lucille practically ran through her house, checking every lock twice. Her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the window latches. Only when she was certain everything was secure did she allow herself to breathe. That night her dreams were filled with the bobcat. It stood at the edge of a moonlit clearing, its scar casting an eerie glow through the mist. The creature turned and walked into the woods, pausing to look back at her as if expecting her to follow. Through the trees, she could make out a shadowy figure waiting in the darkness, just out of sight. Lucille jerked awake in the middle of the night, her nightgown soaked with sweat. The wind chimes tinkled softly somewhere in the house, though she couldn't tell if it was real or an echo from her dream. Even in her bedroom, she could feel the weight of the bobcat's gaze, as real and heavy as a physical touch. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lucille's yard as James's truck pulled up. He stepped out carrying a large metal cage and various supplies, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Morning, Lucille," he called out with a reassuring smile. "Got everything we need here to make sure the bobcat doesn't cause any more trouble." Lucille wrapped her sweater tighter around herself. "Thank you for coming back, James. I know it must sound crazy, but—" "Hey, nothing crazy about being concerned," he said, setting down his equipment. "Let's get this trap set up." They walked to the edge of the woods where James began assembling the cage. His movements were precise and practiced as he explained each step. "The door will snap shut as soon as the animal steps on this plate," he demonstrated. "Won't hurt it at all. Just keeps it contained until we can get it proper care." As he worked, James grew quiet, his hands slowing. "You know, all this talk about the bobcat coming back, it reminds me of something." He paused, adjusting the trigger mechanism. "My son Daniel. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Lucille sat on a nearby log, listening. "He wanted to be a musician," James continued, his voice softening. "I pushed him to take over the family construction business instead. Said all the things fathers shouldn't say about real jobs and responsibility. Now he's in Nashville, and he shook his head. "I keep thinking about calling, but pride gets in the way." "I understand," Lucille said quietly. "My daughter Maggie, we had a terrible fight about her art career." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I said some awful things. She walked out, and I let her go." James nodded, checking the trap's door. "Sometimes the hardest part is admitting we were wrong." "How do you live with it?" Lucille asked. "Not well," James admitted. "But maybe that's the point. We're not supposed to live with it. Maybe we're supposed to fix it." He finished setting up the trap and stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "I'll check this daily, and you call me immediately if anything happens, okay? Day or night." "Thank you, James," Lucille said, walking him back to his truck. As James's vehicle disappeared down the dirt road, Lucille stood at the edge of her porch. The metal trap gleamed in the morning light, waiting silently among the trees. But something told her that catching the bobcat wouldn't be as simple as setting a trap, not when it felt like the animal was trying to tell her something she wasn't ready to hear. Lucille pulled her quilt up to her chin, trying to find comfort in its familiar warmth. The day's conversation with James had stirred up memories she usually kept locked away. Outside her bedroom window, tree branches swayed gently, their leaves whispering in the night breeze. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, but her mind kept drifting to Maggie's face, to the hurt in her eyes during their last argument. The soft rustling of leaves had become a constant companion these past few nights, like nature itself was trying to tell her something. Then she heard it, her name, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. "Lucille!" Her eyes snapped open. She held her breath, listening intently. "Lucille." The whisper came again, clearer this time. It didn't sound like the wind anymore. It sounded like someone was standing right outside her window. The whispers grew more insistent, building in intensity until suddenly, Maggie. Her daughter's name hung in the air like smoke. Lucille's hands trembled as she pushed back her covers and crept to the window. Her heart thundered in her chest as she gripped the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside. The wood stood like a wall of darkness at the edge of her property. Nothing moved, but the whispers continued, sending chills down her spine. Each utterance of her name, of Maggie's name, brought back flashes of memory. Maggie's first art show in high school. The proud smile on her face. The argument about art school that had torn them apart. A low growl cut through the whispers, followed by the sudden movement of bushes near her window. Then, as quickly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Lucille backed away from the window. Her hands shook as she moved through the house, checking every lock twice. The deadbolt on the front door, the latch on the back door. Each window lock clicked reassuringly under her trembling fingers, but it didn't ease the knot in her stomach. In the living room, she sank into her armchair and pulled an old photo from the side table drawer. The picture showed Maggie at 7 years old, gap-toothed and beaming, holding up a crayon drawing. Tears welled in Lucille's eyes as she traced her daughter's face with her finger. "I'm so sorry, Maggie," she whispered into the quiet room. "I'm so sorry." The wind chimes outside her porch began to clatter, their chaotic melody filling the night air. The morning fog rolled across Lucille's property like a thick blanket, turning familiar shapes into ghostly silhouettes. She settled into her porch chair, wrapping both hands around her steaming coffee mug for warmth. Angel, her faithful companion, lay at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. Suddenly, Angel's head snapped up. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he fixed his gaze on the misty tree line. Lucille followed his stare, her breath catching as she made out a familiar shape through the fog. The bobcat stood at the edge of the woods, its movements slow and pained. Its injured leg barely touched the ground as it limped forward a few steps. The scar along its side seemed to pulse faintly, even in the dim morning light. "Easy, Angel," Lucille whispered, reaching down to pat his head. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed James's number. "James, the bobcat's back, and it's hurt badly. Could you come right away?" Within an hour, the crunch of tires on gravel announced James's arrival. He emerged from his truck carrying additional equipment, a larger trap, thick protective gloves, and fresh bait. "Let's try to get this done quickly," James said, his voice low and steady. "The sooner we can help it, the better." They approached the trap site carefully, James carrying the bait while Lucille kept watch. The fog had thinned slightly, but visibility remained poor beyond the first line of trees. A deep, guttural growl cut through the morning stillness. It was unlike anything Lucille had ever heard. Too deep for a bobcat, too menacing for any normal wildlife. She and James stopped in their tracks, scanning the woods. Through the shifting mist, Lucille caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. A massive, dark figure moved between the trees, too tall and broad to be any local animal. It seemed to shift and fade like smoke, never fully visible, but unmistakably present. Angel's barking pierced the air, fierce and protective. The bobcat remained where it was, watching them, with an unnaturally steady gaze, as if waiting for something to unfold. "Let's get back to the house," James muttered, his usual composure clearly shaken. They retreated quickly, the growling following them until they reached the safety of Lucille's porch. After James left, Lucille stood at her window, peering out at the misty woods. The shadowy presence felt like more than just another forest creature. It carried weight, intention. A shiver ran down her spine as she watched the fog swirl between the trees. That afternoon, Lucille stood in her kitchen, her hands trembling as she cut the raw chicken into small pieces. The familiar task felt different today, weighted with meaning she couldn't quite explain. Through the window, the woods loomed dark and mysterious, hiding secrets she was only beginning to understand. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, arranging the meat on a chipped blue plate. But something deep inside told her it wasn't crazy at all. The grass was damp under her feet as she walked toward the trap James had set. Each step felt deliberate, like she was moving through a dream. The metal cage gleamed dully in the afternoon light, waiting like an open mouth. As she bent down to place the plate near the trap's entrance, a rush of memories hit her with startling clarity. Maggie at 7, painting with watercolors at the kitchen table. Her tongue stuck out in concentration. Maggie at 13, slamming her bedroom door after another fight about her grades. Maggie at 18, her face flushed with anger as she clutched her art school acceptance letter. "You're throwing your life away," Lucille had shouted that final day. The words echoed in her mind now, sharp as broken glass. Standing at the edge of the woods, Lucille felt a pull she couldn't explain. The trees seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling with secrets. She took a step forward, then another. The forest's darkness beckoned like an old friend. That night, her dreams were vivid and raw. She was back in their last argument, but everything was twisted, distorted. Maggie's voice merged with animal growls, her daughter's tear-stained face flickering with the image of the Bobcat's glowing scar. "You never supported me," Dream Maggie screamed. "You never even tried to understand." The words morphed into growls, deep and threatening. The Bobcat's eyes gleamed in the darkness, its scar pulsing like a beating heart. Lucille tried to reach for her daughter, but she kept dissolving into shadows. She woke with a gasp at 3 a.m., her pillow wet with tears. Her chest ached with a pain that felt physical, as though her heart was trying to break free. The moonlight cast strange shadows on her bedroom wall, and somewhere in the distance, she heard a cry. Whether from the Bobcat or her own memories, she couldn't tell. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Lucille wiped her eyes with trembling hands. The weight of 10 years of silence pressed down on her shoulders. The Bobcat's appearances, its mysterious scar, the strange pull she felt toward the woods. None of it felt random anymore. It was as if the universe was forcing her to face what she'd been running from all these years. "I have to fix this," she whispered into the darkness. Her voice sounded stronger than she felt, but the resolution in her heart was real. The time for hiding from her past was over. The morning sun filtered through the misty air as Lucille stepped onto her porch, coffee cup in hand. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it, the Bobcat, finally caught in the trap. Angel's sharp barks pierced the quiet morning, but he stayed firmly on the porch, hackles raised. Lucille set her coffee down with trembling hands and moved closer. The Bobcat didn't thrash or growl. It sat perfectly still, watching her with those piercing eyes. The scar along its side looked angry and inflamed, seeming to pulse with each breath the animal took. In the morning light, the wound had an otherworldly quality that made Lucille's skin prickle. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring the Bobcat or herself. James arrived within 30 minutes of her call, his truck crunching on the gravel driveway. He approached the trap with practiced efficiency, but Lucille stepped forward before he could begin his usual procedure. "I want to keep it here," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "In my shed." James frowned, running a hand through his gray-streaked hair. "Lucille, that's not standard procedure. This animal needs professional care." "Please," she interrupted. "I can't explain it, but I need to do this." Something in her voice made James pause. He studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but we do this properly." They spent the next hour preparing the shed. James helped her set up a large cage with fresh water, bedding, and enough space for the bobcat to move comfortably. He showed her how to provide food safely and explained the signs of infection she should watch for. Throughout the entire process, the bobcat remained eerily calm. Its eyes followed Lucille's every movement, gleaming with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a wild animal. When they finally transferred it to the larger cage, it moved with deliberate grace, never taking its gaze off Lucille. "I'll bring more supplies tomorrow," James said, packing up his equipment. "But Lucille," he paused at the shed door, "be careful. This isn't a house cat. It's still wild, no matter how calm it seems." Lucille nodded, but her attention was fixed on the bobcat. The scar along its side seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the shed, pulsing like a beacon. After James left, she pulled up an old wooden chair and sat down, studying the mysterious creature that had upended her quiet life. The bobcat stared back, its eyes holding secrets that seemed to reach into her very soul. The scar glowed faintly in the shadows, and Lucille felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against her heart. All the pain she'd buried, all the regret about Maggie. It felt closer to the surface than ever before, as if the bobcat's presence was slowly pulling it free. The night wrapped around Lucille's house like a heavy blanket, but sleep remained out of reach. She huddled in her living room armchair, pulling her grandmother's quilt tighter around her shoulders. The whispers started softly at first, barely audible above the ticking of the old wall clock. "Lucille." The sound drifted through the room like smoke. Her hands trembled as she gripped the blanket harder. The whispers grew stronger, more insistent, until they seemed to come from every corner of the house. "Lucille, Maggie, Lucille, Maggie." The voices swelled into a chorus that made her head spin. She pressed her hands against her ears, but it didn't help. The sound seemed to be inside her very bones now. Suddenly, a scream tore through her body, and Lucille crumpled to the floor. She wasn't sure if the sound came from her or the voices, but it ripped through her defenses like paper. Memories crashed over her in waves, vivid and raw. Little Maggie in pigtails showing her a crayon drawing. Teenage Maggie, face flushed with anger, clutching her sketchbook. The final argument played out in perfect detail. Maggie standing in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. "Art school isn't a real future." Lucille heard her own voice, harsh and dismissive. "You need something practical, something stable." "It's my life," Maggie had shouted back. "Why can't you support what I love instead of trying to control everything?" The sound of the front door slamming echoed in Lucille's mind, followed by tires crunching on gravel as Maggie drove away. 10 years of silence stretched between that moment and now, filled with birthday cards returned unopened and holiday dinners, with an empty chair. As the screaming faded to a whisper, Lucille lay on the floor, gasping. The truth hit her with stunning clarity. She had pushed Maggie away, let her own fears and rigid expectations destroy their relationship. Through tear-blurred eyes, she looked out the window toward the shed. The bobcat sat in the doorway, watching. Its scar pulsed with a soft, ethereal light in the darkness, like a beacon calling her toward something she'd been too afraid to face. Exhausted, Lucille dragged herself onto the couch. Her whole body ached, but her mind felt strangely clear. As she drifted off to sleep, the bobcat's glowing scar burned behind her eyelids, a reminder that she could no longer hide from the past. The first rays of sunlight crept through Lucille's living room window, stirring her from a restless sleep on the couch. Her neck ached from the awkward position, but the emotional exhaustion from the night before weighed heavier than any physical discomfort. She pulled herself up slowly, her blanket sliding to the floor. Through the window, she spotted the bobcat in its cage. The animal sat perfectly still, its golden eyes fixed on her with an uncanny awareness. Unlike the wild, frightened creature they'd trapped yesterday, it now emanated an almost peaceful presence. The morning air felt crisp against Lucille's skin as she stepped outside. Dew sparkled on the grass, and birds called softly from the trees. Angel padded behind her, staying closer than usual as they approached the shed. His usual wariness seemed replaced by curiosity. Standing before the cage, Lucille felt something shift inside her. The bobcat's gaze held steady, and its infamous scar, while still visible, had lost its angry red glow. Instead, it shimmered faintly, like morning mist. A sense of understanding passed between them, something Lucille couldn't explain but felt deep in her bones. She prepared the bobcat's food with careful movements, speaking softly as she worked. "You're not just here by accident, are you?" The animal blinked slowly in response. James's truck rumbled up the driveway around 9. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, carrying his medical kit. "How's our patient this morning?" "Different," Lucille said. "Calmer, like it's, She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Like it's waiting for something." As James checked the bobcat's condition, Lucille told him about the previous night, the overwhelming memories, the whispers, the moment of clarity about Maggie. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. James's hand stilled on his equipment. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about Daniel a lot since we talked. Haven't spoken to him in 3 years." He straightened up, meeting Lucille's eyes. "Yesterday I found myself looking up his number. Will you call him?" "Maybe." James glanced at the bobcat. "Sounds crazy, but watching you face your past, it's made me think about my own mistakes." The bobcat watched their exchange with those knowing eyes, its scarred side catching the morning light. Lucille felt that same mix of connection and unease she'd experienced since first encountering the creature. After completing his checkup, James packed his supplies. "The wound's healing well," he said. "Whatever brought this animal here." He shook his head, leaving the thought unfinished. Lucille stood by the shed after James drove away. The weight of unspoken words and years of regret pressed against her chest, but alongside it burned a new feeling, determination tinged with fear. The bobcat's presence felt like a mirror reflecting her own scars, offering both challenge and opportunity. Lucille sat at her weathered oak desk, smoothing out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her favorite blue pen. The bobcat's steady gaze from the shed seemed to give her strength as she began to write. "Dear Editor," she wrote, then paused. The words came slowly at first, describing the stormy night when she first encountered the injured bobcat. But as she continued, her pen moved faster, the story flowing more freely. "Sometimes wounds aren't just physical," she wrote. "The bobcat's scar reminds me of the invisible marks we all carry, the ones that come from words we wish we could take back and moments we let slip away." Sunlight streamed through her window as she described the bobcat's recurring visits, its mysterious scar, and the way it seemed to appear just when she needed to face her deepest regrets. Her writing became more personal, though she carefully avoided mentioning Maggie by name. "Like this wounded creature," she continued, "we sometimes need help to heal. But first, we must acknowledge our scars and accept that they're part of our story. After several revisions, Lucille sealed the letter in a crisp white envelope. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote the newspaper's address. The drive to the post office felt longer than usual, each mile giving her second thoughts. But something pushed her forward. Perhaps the same force that had brought the Bobcat to her fence that stormy night. Inside the small-town post office, Lucille hesitated one final time before dropping the envelope into the outgoing mail slot. The soft thud felt oddly final. That evening, her phone rang just as she was preparing dinner. The newspaper's editor, Sarah Matthews, spoke with genuine enthusiasm about Lucille's letter. "There's something universal in your words," Sarah said warmly. "Would you consider letting us publish this in Sunday's edition?" Lucille's throat tightened. Publishing the letter meant everyone in town would read it, maybe even Maggie if the story traveled far enough. The thought made her pulse quicken. She started, then took a deep breath. "Yes, you can publish it." After hanging up, Lucille stepped onto her porch. The setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. She gripped the porch railing, her heart heavy with anticipation of what sharing her story might bring. The morning sun filtered through Lucille's kitchen window as she cracked eggs into a bowl. The phone's sharp ring pierced the quiet, making her jump. Her heart stopped when she saw the name on the screen, Maggie. The phone felt heavy in her trembling hands. "Hello?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom?" Maggie's voice was soft, hesitant. I read your article about the Bobcat." Lucille sank into a kitchen chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Oh," was all she could manage. "It was beautiful," Maggie continued, her voice catching slightly. "The part about invisible scars, about healing." She trailed off, and the silence stretched between them like a delicate thread. "I've been living in Charlotte," Maggie finally said. "Only 2 hours away. I've thought about calling so many times, but—" "I know," Lucille whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I've thought about it too. When I read about the Bobcat, something just clicked. Those wounds you wrote about, they felt so familiar." Lucille's hand clutched the phone tighter. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. That fight, the things I said about your art, I was wrong. So wrong." A soft sob came through the line. "Mom." "I was scared for you," Lucille continued, her voice breaking. "But I should have supported your dreams instead of trying to change them." Another long pause filled the space between them, but this one felt different, like a bridge slowly being rebuilt. "Could I—" Maggie hesitated. "Could I come see you? Maybe tomorrow?" "Yes," Lucille answered immediately. "Please. I'd love that." After they hung up, Lucille moved through the house in a daze, straightening pictures and dusting surfaces that didn't need it. She changed the sheets in Maggie's old room, her hands lingering on the familiar floral pattern. As evening approached, Lucille stood by her living room window. The Bobcat lay peacefully in its cage, its once angry scar now just a faint line along its side. The sight brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to the quiet air around her. The gravel crunched under Maggie's car tires as she pulled into the driveway. Lucille's hands gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white with tension. She watched her daughter emerge from the car, taking in every detail. Maggie's dark hair was shorter now, styled in a way that framed her face. She wore a paint-splattered denim jacket, evidence that she hadn't given up on her art. Their eyes met across the yard. Time seemed to freeze as mother and daughter stood locked in that moment, years of unspoken words hanging between them. "Hi, Mom," Maggie said softly, climbing the porch steps. "Hello, sweetheart." Lucille's voice cracked on the endearment. They sat awkwardly in the living room at first, making small talk about the weather and Maggie's drive over. Angel lay at Lucille's feet, occasionally lifting his head to study their visitor. Through the window, the bobcat watched silently from its cage in the shed. "Your article," Maggie began, then paused. "It made me think about a lot of things." "I hoped it might reach you," Lucille admitted. "I didn't know how else to." "I was so angry for so long," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "Every time you told me art wasn't practical, that I needed a real career. It felt like you were saying I wasn't good enough." Tears welled in Lucille's eyes. "I was scared for you. I wanted you to be secure, stable. But I handled it all wrong. Instead of supporting your dreams, I tried to force you into a box that wasn't meant for you." They talked for hours, piecing together the puzzle of their broken relationship. Maggie shared stories about her struggles to establish herself as an artist, the lonely holidays, the time she'd driven past the house but couldn't bring herself to stop. Lucille spoke of her regrets, the countless nights she'd sat up wondering where she'd gone wrong, and how the bobcat had somehow forced her to face her pain. Gradually, the tension eased. They found themselves laughing about old memories. The time Maggie had painted her bedroom walls without permission, the family camping trips where everything seemed to go wrong, but somehow ended up perfect. The afternoon light was growing dim when Maggie finally stood to leave. She hesitated, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Lucille in a fierce hug. "I've missed you," she whispered against her mother's shoulder. Lucille held her daughter tight, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched Maggie's car disappear down the driveway. For the first time in years, her heart felt truly light. The morning sun filtered through Lucille's kitchen window as she gathered the remnants of yesterday's reunion with Maggie. Her fingers lingered on the coffee mug her daughter had used, still marked with a faint lipstick stain. The familiar scent of Maggie's perfume clung to the blanket she'd wrapped around herself during their long conversation. "What do you think, Angel?" Lucille asked her faithful companion as she folded the blanket. "It went better than we could have hoped, didn't it?" Angel's tail thumped against the floor in response, and Lucille felt tears welling up again, happy tears this time. In the shed, the bobcat lay quietly in its cage as Lucille approached with fresh water and food. The morning light revealed how much its scar had healed, now just a pale line across its side rather than the angry, glowing wound it had been. Angel stood in the doorway, watching with gentle curiosity. "You knew, didn't you?" Lucille whispered to the bobcat. "You came here to help me face what I'd been running from." The animal's golden eyes met hers, calm and knowing. "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." Back in the house, Lucille pulled out an old shoebox from her closet. She carefully selected photographs: Maggie's 5th birthday party, her first art show in middle school, the two of them hiking in the mountains. At the bottom of the box, she found what she was looking for: a small watercolor painting Maggie had made in 3rd grade. It showed their house with 2 stick figures holding hands in front, surrounded by wobbly flowers. "I kept everything," Lucille murmured, running her fingers over the childish brushstrokes. She placed these treasures in a padded envelope, along with a handwritten note expressing her love and hope for their future. The bobcat watched her through the shed window as she sealed the package. Its presence felt different now, lighter, like a burden that had served its purpose. Lucille knew it was time to let it return to the wild, but she wanted James's help to ensure a safe release. She placed the care package by the front door, ready for tomorrow's trip to the post office. Standing at her kitchen window, Lucille gazed at the shed. The thought of the bobcat leaving brought a bittersweet ache to her chest. But she understood that healing sometimes meant letting go. "We both have to move forward now," she whispered, watching Angel doze in the afternoon sun. The package for Maggie sat waiting by the door, a bridge to their future together. James's truck crunched over the gravel driveway as Lucille stood waiting on her porch. The morning air felt crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of late summer flowers. Angel wagged his tail as James approached, toolbox in hand. "Ready?" James asked softly. Lucille nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked to the shed together, where the bobcat lay calmly in its cage. Its scar had faded to a thin silver line, barely visible beneath its fur. The animal watched them with those knowing golden eyes as they carefully lifted the cage. "Steady now," James murmured as they carried it to the edge of the woods. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. They set the cage down gently. James unlatched the door and stepped back, joining Lucille at a safe distance. The bobcat emerged slowly, its movements graceful and deliberate. At the edge of the woods, it paused and turned, fixing its gaze on Lucille. Tears welled in her eyes as she met that final look. The bobcat's presence had changed everything, brought her daughter back, forced her to face her past, helped her heal. The animal held her gaze for a long moment before turning away. "Strange how things work out," James said quietly as they watched the bobcat disappear into the shadows of the trees. "When you called about that injured bobcat, I never imagined—" "That it would change our lives?" Lucille finished. James nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've been thinking about Daniel a lot lately. Seeing you and Maggie reconnect, well, it gave me hope." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call him today." "That's wonderful, James." Lucille touched his arm gently. "Sometimes we just need a little push to do what our hearts have wanted all along." They walked back toward the house, their footsteps light on the dewy grass. The morning seemed brighter somehow, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. The wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, their melody sweet and clear. On the porch, Lucille turned to James. "Thank you for everything, not just with the bobcat, but for understanding, for sharing your own story." James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you too, Lucille. Sometimes helping others helps us find our own way forward." They stood there for a moment, looking out at the peaceful woods where the bobcat had disappeared, both feeling the weight of the moment and the lightness of new beginnings. That evening, Lucille settled into her favorite wicker chair on the porch, a leather-bound journal in her lap. The pages crackled as she opened it, dust dancing in the golden evening light. She hadn't written in it since Maggie left, but now the words seemed to flow naturally. "The bobcat came like a messenger," she wrote, her pen gliding across the paper. "Its scar reminded me of my own wounds, the ones I'd tried so hard to ignore." Angel sprawled at her feet, his gentle breathing mixing with the choruses of crickets and evening birds. The forest that had felt so threatening now swayed peacefully in the breeze, like old friends nodding hello. Lucille paused, then turned to a fresh page. "Dear Maggie," she began, her heart full, "seeing you today felt like coming home. I want you to know." She poured out her hopes for their future, her regrets, and her pride in the woman Maggie had become. As the sun painted the sky in soft pinks and purples, Lucille found herself glancing at her old easel in the corner of the porch. It stood bare, collecting cobwebs, but something stirred in her at the sight of it. She remembered how she used to paint alongside Maggie, before their arguments about art school tore them apart. Maybe it was time to pick up a brush again. Angel's soft bark interrupted her thoughts. He wagged his tail, resting his head on her knee. Lucille scratched behind his ears, grateful for his steady presence through all the lonely years. "We're not alone anymore, are we, boy?" she whispered. The porch creaked gently beneath her chair as she rocked, feeling more at peace than she had in years. The walls she'd built around her heart seemed to crumble a little more with each passing moment. Lucille closed her journal, running her fingers over its worn cover. Standing up, she gave one last look at the dusky forest before heading inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. The evening breeze followed her in, carrying the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees as Maggie's car pulled into the driveway. Lucille's heart swelled at the sight of her daughter stepping out, carefully cradling a wrapped canvas. Angel's tail wagged enthusiastically as he recognized her, and Maggie's face lit up with a warm smile. "Mom, I made something for you," Maggie said, walking up the porch steps. She handed over the canvas with slightly trembling hands. Lucille unwrapped it carefully, her breath catching as she revealed the painting. The scene captured the woods behind her house in soft, dreamy strokes. Morning mist curled between the trees, and rays of sunlight filtered through the branches. It was exactly how the forest looked on peaceful mornings. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Lucille whispered, touching the canvas gently. They moved into the kitchen, where the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Together, they prepared lunch, moving around each other with growing ease. The sound of their laughter filled the house as they shared memories of previous cooking disasters. "Remember when I tried to make you breakfast in bed for Mother's Day?" Maggie chuckled, chopping vegetables. "The smoke alarm went off and you came running downstairs in your robe." "Those were the blackest pancakes I'd ever seen," Lucille smiled, stirring the soup. "But you were so proud of yourself for trying." As they sat down to eat, their conversation deepened. Maggie's eyes grew misty as she described her lonely nights in the city, wanting to call, but afraid of rejection. Lucille listened intently, her heart aching for the pain they'd both carried. "I started therapy last year," Maggie admitted softly. "It helped me understand why I was so angry, why I felt so misunderstood." Lucille reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I've been doing a lot of thinking too, especially these past weeks. That Bobcat," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "It brought up so many memories, so many dreams. I kept seeing your face in my sleep." "Tell me about them," Maggie said, leaning forward with genuine interest. They moved to the living room, where Angel curled up at Maggie's feet. Lucille described her vivid dreams, the whispers in the night, and the strange connection she'd felt to the injured animal. Maggie listened intently, occasionally wiping away tears. "I want to start painting again," Lucille confessed. "Being around your art, seeing how it helps you express yourself, I miss that creative spark." Maggie's face brightened. "We could paint together. I could come up on weekends, maybe set up easels on the porch." "I'd love that," Lucille smiled. "It might take time for me to get back into it." "We have time, Mom," Maggie assured her. "We have all the time we need to figure this out." When the afternoon began to fade, Maggie gathered her things to leave. They stood by the door, both reluctant to say goodbye. Lucille pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Drive safe," Lucille whispered, holding on for an extra moment. She watched from the porch as Maggie's car wound down the driveway, her heart full of newfound hope. The evening sun painted long shadows across Lucille's front yard as she settled into her favorite porch chair. Angel sprawled at her feet, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, but his ears alert, trained on the darkening woods. The day's warmth lingered in the wooden boards beneath her feet. Lucille wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of chamomile tea, breathing in its gentle aroma. Her mind drifted to the afternoon spent with Maggie. How natural it had felt to move around the kitchen together again. A slight movement at the tree line caught her attention. There, in the fading light, stood the bobcat. But this time, it wasn't alone. Two small cubs huddled close to its legs, their spotted fur blending with the shadows. Lucille held her breath, not daring to move. The bobcat's scar was barely visible now, just a faint line along its side. It locked eyes with Lucille one last time, and in that moment, she felt a deep understanding wash over her. Like her own healing relationship with Maggie, the bobcat had found its way forward, nurturing new life despite its wounds. Angel lifted his head, but remained calm as they watched the small family disappear into the forest. Lucille reached for her journal, which had become a constant companion these past weeks. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. The bobcat came back today, whole and strong, with two cubs by its side. Looking at them, I realized how far we've all come. The scar that brought it to my fence that stormy night has faded. Just like the pain between Maggie and me is slowly healing. James is reaching out to Daniel. We're all finding our way back to what matters most. She paused, listening to the soft tinkling of wind chimes. The sound was different now. No longer eerie or foreboding, but peaceful, like a gentle lullaby. The stars began appearing overhead, one by one, tiny points of light in the deepening blue. Lucille smiled, feeling the lightness in her heart. She sat quietly, watching the night unfold, grateful for second chances and the mysterious ways healing finds us. If you enjoyed the story of Lucille, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.